Hi, curious friends. Welcome to the Building the Best Brain podcast. If it's your first time here, welcome. If it's not your first time here, welcome back. I am super excited to put out this episode because this is going to be the final episode of the topic that we've been talking about the last couple weeks. It's been over a month now around the inside out brain. The inside out brain being how your internal state, right? So your brain activity, your ability to regulate your nervous system, how it impacts the world and people around you. And it's not a series where you get to beat yourself up for all the things that have happened to you, but it's more around how much empowerment you truly have when it comes to the outside world, essentially, right? That we have a lot more control than we've been taught or we give ourselves credit for. And I appreciate your guys' patience. And if you've been following along this past series, or if you've just been following along my podcast in general or social media, you may know, or you are about to know, that I have officially submitted my PhD thesis in neuroscience. So I did that the end of May, Friday, the end of May. And I'm in the process of scheduling my defense now. I don't have a date yet, but I'm really looking forward to, I think after this episode, I may do a podcast episode on that entirely, just because there's a lot of lessons that I have learned and patterns that I have observed in writing my thesis that I think are applicable to a lot of different areas and scenarios. And anyway, that is something that we'll talk about later. But all of that to say, one of the things that I was looking forward to the most after finishing my submission, my thesis submission process, is to be jumping on here and chatting about the inside out brain. And the topic that we're going to be unpacking today when it comes to the inside out brain is all about stress, which is awesome. It's this idea that science has shown in different ways that stress regulation is not selfish. And your ability to regulate your stress is a gift to others. And I don't mean in the maybe logical way, although the logical way makes a lot of sense too, right? That when we're able to regulate ourselves, we place less demands on people, right, to regulate us or to get them to be a certain way so that we can be a certain way. But the gifts that stress regulation give also beyond showing up as a more well-resourced version of yourself is deeper than that. It goes beyond that. And I want to, you can maybe think about this even when it comes to certain relationships you have, right? So, you know how sometimes you meet certain friends and certain friends, even though they're, let's say, not greeting you with a hug, feel like a hug as a person. Like you just sit down beside them, you haven't said anything yet, and it feels like a warm hug. Or if you're somebody who's gone to therapy or goes to therapy, even just sitting in the chair of your therapist, you guys haven't said anything yet, you feel comfortable to share vulnerable things. You feel more relaxed. And if you don't know this about me, I teach yoga part-time. I've been doing it all throughout my PhD. This is something I notice a lot in teaching yoga is that, certain teachers, right, like you're sitting on your mat, you haven't done any movement or breath work yet, and even just their voice gets you in a more calm state. There is something to that where people that are very regulated, that are very grounded, that are in their parasympathetic state, which we'll talk a little bit more on this podcast, the difference between the parasympathetic state and the sympathetic state, it does change something in those that are in their vicinity. And I have had this experience in those areas, but a really great example of how this plays out a lot is in relationships and intimate relationships. And there are scientific studies that look at that dynamic of, how does one's person ability to regulate their stress impact the other. And I've had it happen in both ways. I've had it happen where it's gone really well, right? I mean, I'm somebody that, studies stress regulation all the time. I help people with their stress regulation. I'm always looking for new studies. I'm always looking for new tools. And even with all that, I have my moments because I'm human that my emotions get the better of me. I get in a hyper stress state, and it's so interesting because in relationships, because especially when you're living with the person, right, you really do sync up in a lot of ways, both with your lifestyles and your schedules, but also in your biology, that they can really reflect back to you what's happening in you, even if you're not aware of it or conscious of it. And so the story that I'm thinking of is actually, it started with a friend. So I am very fortunate that I have a few close friends in Montreal. This is the city where I'm doing my PhD. And, they both, I'm actually thinking of the few friends that I have that I'm really close with. They both actually have their PhDs. One has them in neuroscience, another one is a clinical psychologist. They're both married, they both have children, and they're both living really like beautiful lives, and they, you know, are very happy with where they're at in their life, and they're doing their thing. We're all doing our thing, living our lives. And of course, as we get older, it's more and more precious the time we get to spend together because her schedules get fuller, because they're adding more more kids to the family. And anyway, life gets lifing, and it's very important to be able to carve out time to be social, carve out time to be with our friends. And that's what I did with one of my friends last year. So this would have been right after my candidacy exam. So not my candidacy, sorry, my thesis seminar. So in the PhD program, you have a thesis seminar, which is a presentation you give to your committee. Your committee are professors that you meet every year, once a year, just to get like a progress update. And they also come from the neuroscience field, but slightly different disciplines or topics. So they also give you valuable feedback that you maybe wouldn't get from your supervisor. After that milestone, the thesis seminar, which is kind of extra special, they decide kind of what is the timeline for you to submit your thesis, right? Like if there's more experiments that need to be done, if you can start writing right away, how you can write your thesis. And so I remember finishing that, and one of the first things I wanted to do was see one of my friends I haven't seen in a while. And it just so happened that, life things, right? She was about to put an offer on the house and was trying to put her condo up for sale. And so we had, and I'm sure people know this feeling. We basically had a coffee date that was we went to get like a nice coffee, and then we brought it to her condo, and like I watched her box up stuff, and we were, chatting and boxing and cleaning, which is still friend time. It's still friend time. We're just merging it with with an errand. And naturally, it had been so long since we chatted that we had a lot to talk about. And the conversation naturally veered to talking about life things, right? So like how the kids were doing, how she was progressing in her degree. She submitted her thesis already, and she was in the stage I'm at now where they were kind of planning when to defend. And then she was talking about house things, kid things, how things were going with her husband. And then she naturally had questions for me all around the same thing. And what I was noticing, right, was that there was like a certain percentage of that I felt super comfortable talking about. So I felt comfortable talking about how my partner and I were doing, because we recently moved in together at that time. We would have moved in together for, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months, and talked a bit about, where I'm at with my degree, talked a bit about how things were going with the business, and I felt comfortable talking about all that. And then we veered into kind of like timeline scheduling things. And the disclaimer here is this is a reflection of me. What happened next? It is not my friend's fault for bringing up these questions. And there's nothing wrong, inherently wrong with these questions, but there are questions around, like when would I buy a house? You know, what kind of job am I looking for? Like, what's my next step after my PhD? When am I going to start having kids? When am I going to get married? All things like that. And there's inherently nothing wrong with that, but I was getting into a space where I was feeling, or I was really leaning into the feeling of being uncertain. And that's something that I've been exploring a lot, especially in the process of writing my thesis, of how to feel grounded in the uncertainty, right? And not let it consume you entirely and kind of deplete your energy resources by being chronically stressed because things aren't certain. Because if we're only feeling grounded and what would another good word be? Grounded, self-assured, basically being able to be in our parasympathetic state when things are certain, then it's just so exhausting. But anyway, that's something that I suppose I hadn't focused on or entertained because I was so focused on getting to this, thesis seminar milestone that I hadn't really allowed myself to explore those topics yet. And anyway, so we were talking about them, talking about them, and I was getting more and more uncertain and more stressed out and felt uneasy. It was very interesting. I didn't necessarily vocalize that I felt stressed out or that I wanted to change the topic because in my mind I was like, there's nothing logically to be stressed about, right? Like there's many ways to feel grounded and certain in the midst of uncertainty, but I was just not there. I was just not there. And anyway, we were chatting, we were having a good time. I was getting more and more stressed out, and then I left and I met up with my partner. We were going to grab stuff for dinner or something. And I was meeting him. He went to the gym, and the gym was kind of close by to where she lived. And so we met up and we started walking. And he naturally asked me how the conversation went, and how did I enjoy my time with her and what was happening. And I said that everything was good, but I could t and I think he mentioned it. I think he could tell. He's like, "Are you okay?" Like he could tell even without me vocalizing that I was feeling stressed out or uncertain that something was off. He could tell right away. And I said, no, classic, right? No, nothing. Everything's fine. And it's not that I didn't believe that. It's just I wasn't really aware of how off-centered I felt and how stressed I felt. And I remember some of the things that I was talking about with my friend, I brought up with him, and I remember bringing it up in a way that wasn't very inviting and open. Basically, I told him that, one of our plans was blank when it came to like house and kids. And I framed it, it's kind of funny. I framed it in a way that was very like, this is it, right? Like this would be the only way that this would work. And that happens a lot when we're stressed, right? We get into really black and white thinking and we get into absolutes, and these absolutes, even if they're positive in nature, can feel very urgent, right? Because there's no flexibility, they're very rigid. And I remember presenting this to him, and we weren't even really in a space where we could have a meaningful conversation because we were like walking to get food, busy streets of Montreal. It was a winter, so we were like slipping and sliding. And I remember that he said, I don't know exactly what he said, but he was basically kind of put off a little bit by it, not in a negative way, but like in a, oh, is that what you told her? Right? Something very innocent like that. And I remember feeling like full panic, like rush to the face, like thought spiral city. And it didn't take much. And, you know, needless to say that that conversation wasn't very well received because of the level of stress that I was under that I wasn't even aware of. And while it's very easy to look at that interaction and potentially, blame the partner for not agreeing with you, or you maybe think that they're not listening, really what happened was that the whole topic became stressful because of my stress. And I know this because when it happened, he did a great job like reflecting back to me that, you know, this topic was clearly very emotional for me and very stressful for me. And that, there's nothing wrong with the topic itself. There's nothing wrong to talk about these things. There's nothing inherently bad about it, but that, to bring it up the way I did as we were like walking to get food, like it didn't present us like a good opportunity to have a successful conversation about it. And I totally agreed. And I did some work on my end, looking at those topics and really finding ways to regulate myself and not be triggered by them, right? And I won't bore you guys with the details with how I did that, but needless to say that I do feel a lot more regulated and grounded in this transition of uncertainty. And I don't feel like it is urgent or there's anything that I have to do right now that would like 100% do it. And if it doesn't 100% get done in the way that I want it to get done, that my world is ending, right? But that is what it felt like at that moment. And so solving those triggers, these topics in general in our house come up a lot more naturally, a lot more fluidly, and they're much more productive, right? Much, much more productive conversations. And I get texts every once in a while with, new houses to look at, condos to look at. So this idea that like it's not in the cards for me because it's not happening right now is something that I shifted that really helped regulate my stress. But while that's an important piece of this puzzle, the important piece is that through that topic is no longer a stressful, not well received topic in this house. And it's because I took control of my stress regulation. And this really got me thinking about, you know, if I can do this in relationships, right, where, you know, there is kind of higher stakes, right, or there's increased vulnerability, right? Partnerships are incredible at really highlighting where you're most vulnerable. And it's an incredible opportunity to step up and grow from it, right? And of course, everybody's relationship is different and every scenario is different. But instead of going we just can't talk about these things, like our relationship, we just can't talk about these things and go, okay, why is this topic so triggering to me? And how can I be more calm and regulated around it? Completely change the dynamic. And so when I got curious about this and looked at the science behind this, a few things came through that I thought were really interesting. But basically, the potential through line of this is that when you are the most regulated person in the room, when you are the most regulated person in the room, you do have the power to regulate everyone around you. You really do. And when I looked at the science behind this, there's kind of two big topics that emerged that showed this to really be the case. So the first piece of evidence is looking at micro expressions. And this is something that we talked a lot about in the second podcast episode of the Inside Out Brain. And so I'll put the link there to the show notes because I won't dive into it too deeply here. But basically, that as humans, we're constantly, even without our awareness, scanning people's faces to be able to know what emotional states they're in. And this is because this is a very big part of our survival, right? When we're walking in a room, are we walking in a room that our friends, it's funny, my partner says this a lot. He studied masculinity and he always says that with men in particular, right? Like when a group of guys, like if you're walking into a room with a group of guys, like the first question is like friend or foe? Like are we bros or are we fighting? And we all have that kind of question in our mind when we're walking into a big group of people we don't know. And the way that we get that information before anybody says anything is people's facial expressions, their microfacial expressions. We can then gain a lot of information about their emotional state, if they're happy, if they're pissed off, if they're really stressed out, if they're disgusted by something, if they're jealous, if they're judging you. And so, with stress, when we're under stress, we do hold our face in different shapes. We do have different micro expressions, especially when it comes to our eyes, right? When we're in a stressed out state, our eyes dilate a lot because the idea is that we need that light to be able to constantly scan for our environment. And so if you walk into a room or you walk to your partner, or let's say your therapist, right? Because therapists are human too, and you detect subconsciously, right, that they're stressed, you may be more on edge as well. And this is through the facial recognition, which is why I love so monthly, sometimes 2 times a month, sometimes even three, depending how I feel and how the schedule goes, of course. I host these Pick My Brain webinars. And basically, it's like a live Q&A, which you can submit questions virtually or you can come live. I always prioritize people live, but it's been great to have questions submitted in as well because they're always really great questions. And that's honestly how we learn, right? It's not so much consuming all the information, but asking questions about the information. It's a very, like, it's something we do as scientists all the time. And I think it's something that we're all little scientists of our own life anyway, right? And the topics are always different for the Pick My Brain. And when we were doing the webinar for the one on body language and facial expressions and how that impacts people's brain activity, someone brought up a great question around Botox and filler because they do impact micro expressions, right? And so they do impact people's ability to subconsciously read what you're presenting. And I would be curious, and there may be a study on this already, and I can go digging for it, but how people that have Botox and filler, how they're received by other people, like in a longitudinal way, and if they can almost have like a before and after with the same person. I highly doubt that study is out there because that is pretty specific, but I know there have been studies that have looked at it in terms of the development of children, right? Like if the mother has Botox and filler and looking at the development of children, that there does seem to be an impact on the child's ability to recognize emotions in other people. But that's a side tangent. That's what those webinars are for, is to get into interesting questions like that. The second piece of evidence when it comes to the ability to regulate your stress influencing everybody else's ability to regulate their stress is through a phenomenon called physiological synchronizing. And so to dive into this, I do want to take a moment to talk about our stress response. So our nervous system comprises of our brain and our spinal cord. And in both the brain, but especially in the spinal cord, there are nerves that run out and run in. And with these nerves, essentially what they're doing is they're innervating different tissues, different muscles, different organs, getting sensory information, so kind of knowing the state of what they are, sending it up the spinal cord to the brain processes, and then the brain can send signals down the spinal cord out the nerves to provide information to these organs, muscles, tissues, right? Typically, the way that we study it is usually it's like sensory information goes in and then motor information goes out. So action information. It's not quite that simple, but it's a good way to be able to understand kind of the flow of information. And so we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. So everything that's encased by bone is our central nervous system, right? Our skull and our spine. And then the autonomic nervous system are those nerves that run in and run out. And this is where our stress response, quote unquote, lives. Even though there are structures in the brain that are involved in our stress response highly involves our peripheral nervous system. And it's in a little subclass called the autonomic nervous system. And the big differentiation between the other systems that are under the peripheral nervous system is that you don't need your conscious awareness. So these are things like our heart rate, our breathing rate, our ability to digest food, and our ability to turn on our stress response, which we call our sympathetic response, or to switch into our parasympathetic response, which is often called our rest and digest. My favorite is feed and breed. And it's this idea, right, that you don't need to spend your energy fighting off any kind of threat, and you can spend your body's energy on digesting food, reproducing the species, right? Like these are all things that you do not have energy for when you're in your sympathetic response, when you're in your fight or flight response. And so when you're in your fight and flight response, there are specific physiological changes that happen. And this makes sense, right? Because most of the activity that's happening is related to our peripheral nervous system, which is all those nerves that are innervating different parts of our body. And our brain is sending signals to do specific things. So, for example, we'll have our breathing rate change. We're going to prioritize our inhale because we need more oxygen. And we need more oxygen because oxygen is used to break up sugars, and sugars is what we use for energy in our body, right? So our muscles will need energy. Our brain, in theory, needs energy as well. So we will prioritize our inhale and we'll often actually breathe through our mouth to get that inhale faster. It's not necessarily more efficient. It's definitely not more efficient long term, but the idea is that you're not in your stress response long term, which is a whole other side tangent that I've talked about in other podcasts. I'll put chronic, I have an episode around chronic stress. I'll put that in the show notes too. Talks a bit about that. And so our breathing rate changes, it gets more shallow. Our heart rate changes. So we'll usually have an increased heart rate. So we're pumping blood faster. And I'm sure you guys have experienced this when you're really, really stressed. You feel like your heart is beating out your chest. And it's interesting. And you might not even always be aware of this, but some of you might be, and you might be like, yeah, I know. We'll sweat more. And so through this sweat, we actually have an increased temperature in our skin. And there's a measure called the galvanic skin response, but it's basically looking at skin conductance. And that's something you can measure, which is basically your skin's ability to, this might sound silly, right? Because you're like, why would you do this? But it's a measure, conduct electricity. And so if it's at an increased temperature and increased moisture, it is more conductance. And so all these physiological changes occur to best help our body address whatever the stressor is, right? And the stressor itself, which is talked a lot more in the chronic stress episode, can be, a bear, it can be an email, it can be a tough conversation with your partner, it can be a past memory. Like there's a lot that can kind of fall under the bucket of a stressor. And what's very interesting is that these physiological changes can sync up with other people. And there's a lot of studies that have looked into this, and I'm not going to go through every single one, but I did put in the show notes a really great review paper that combines a lot of these studies together. So if you're curious about getting into more specifics, you can get in there and see what's up. But they looked at particular relationships. So they looked at couples, of course. They looked at strangers, right? Or teams, so sports teams, work environments. They also looked at a therapist-patient dynamic, or a doctor-patient dynamic, and which some of you guys might be very interested in, they look at a parent-child dynamic. And so one of the things that they really measured that they found, I suppose, the most interesting is the ability to sync up heart rate variability, HRV. Something that you guys maybe know, it's something that is been put in a lot of like Apple Watches or the Aura Ring, right, as a measure of stress. And the way it works is that heart rate variability is looking at your high frequency heart rate, and this is a heart rate that's associated with a stress response. And then it looks at your low frequency heart rate, which is associated with being in your parasympathetic state, your rest and digest state. And they create this ratio where they look at the difference between the two. And so if the difference between the two is low, the assumption is that you're in the higher range and you don't have a lot of variability into the lower range, which means that you don't go into your parasympathetic stress response to the same way, or even one might argue at all. And so, with this physiological synchronization, while that's great, right? And there's a lot of tools that measure this, a lot of stress regulation tools that measure this, right? Meditation, sometimes we measure it, but breath work, there's a lot of breath work exercises that measure its effectiveness using these measures. The question that's most interesting, and there's not the most straightforward answer, is cool. Very cool that we can physiologically sync up to other people without knowing and that it impacts our stress response. But what direction is it, right? Is it the most stressed out person that's making everybody else stressed out? Or is it the least stressed out person, the most grounded, regulated person that is influencing everyone else? And the answer, right, is not the most simple. Like different studies and different contexts show different directions of this. But a pretty good rule of thumb is whoever is most emotionally connected to that state. And so, in some scenarios, that will be the person that is the most stressed out, right? Like coming in, I don't know why I thought this, like coming in like hot and wild, like wild-eyed is the visual I'm getting, right? Super stressed out, talking like a million miles a minute, and everybody else in the room is like, shoulders are up, like on edge. That definitely happens, and there's definitely signs to show that. But when I dug a little deeper to see if there was the other direction that was possible, there's a few examples that came up, and the psychotherapist patient is one, right? And this makes a lot of sense, right? Because I mean, I did lots of therapy. I haven't done therapy in a few years. And, when I went to my therapist, right, I would be sharing really vulnerable things. I would be crying. I did a little bit of EDMR as well. And in that scenario, for those of you who aren't familiar, it is like rapid eye movement therapy. That's obviously not the acronym. This is the best I can do right now. But essentially, with a therapist, you bring up a traumatic memory, a traumatic experience, and then you have lights that you follow or things that you hold in your palm that vibrate one at a time. And so the idea is that you're focusing on the sensation and you're also using your eyes to move side to side. And the therapist will probe you with questions with the idea that you're kind of like almost scrambling the memory and rewriting the memory. And while there's, to my knowledge, no mechanistic studies that look at how this works, my hypothesis is that you're kind of stimulating each side of your brain, right? And you're kind of synchronizing your activity. You're also distracting yourself. So it maybe presents the brain an opportunity to kind of like rewrite and replace the memory in the brain, like shift the activity. But there's a lot of studies that have shown how effective it is. We don't have the mechanism behind it, but there are a lot of studies that show this really helps with people with PTSD as well as with complex PTSD. But if therapists were not grounded and rooted in what they're doing and calm in what they're doing, it could be very, very distressing to have somebody come in a highly emotional state, not regulated at all. And so it is interesting that they're able to be so grounded in themselves that they don't shift their activity into a highly emotionally dysregulated state. And that eventually, right, especially with, I hate to say it, right, but with good therapists, it is important to bring your client or your patient down to a regulated state before you let them like off into the world. And they do that. And a part of the reason why they can do that is because of the regulated state they have on their own. Another really interesting example, and I'm not a parent, so I would love to hear the feedback from people that do have children, is parent-children dynamics. There's quite a few studies that look at, I mean, as kids, right, you're learning everything for the first time, you're growing, you have all these developmental stages that you're just like flying through. And so there's going to be moments, right, where you're not regulated. You're very emotional. You're figuring out what emotions are, how to deal with them, when are they appropriate, when are they not appropriate, how do I express them, do I not express them? And there's a lot of studies that show that parents that are really grounded and really regulated in their stress can really help their child bring them to that level. And so in those scenarios, parents that are really rooted to their stress regulation, even if their kid is like bouncing off the walls, having a temper tantrum, crying on the floor, kicking the wall, that they don't get to that state. And as a result, their kid does eventually meet them where they're at. And it's because of this, partially because of this physiological synchronization, which is super, super interesting. And so, a big takeaway, and I'm really happy that we ended on this one because I will say this till the cows come home. And even when they come home, I'm going to say this always: stress regulation is not selfish. Stress regulation is not selfish. Stress regulation, you taking time to regulate yourself, is the most generous thing that you can do for everyone around you. And guarding it with your life, honestly. And this was maybe a bit intense, but I'll try and like tone it down. The main takeaway here is that pick one thing. Pick just one thing that will help with your stress regulation. And of course, like especially if you are, I have a quiz which will be in the show notes as well, which is around what level you're at in terms of stress regulation and your brain. And a lot of people have been saying that they don't have a stress routine. And so, if you're in the beginning of this journey, something that really deters people from having a stress routine is by making it way too complicated, adding too many things, and then not being able to stick with it because it's so complicated and labor intensive. So, what's going to help you the most is by picking one small thing and doing it consistently. And you have time to build off your stress routine. You have time to build off your tools. But if you don't give one tool a chance, you're never going to get started. So picking one thing that'll help your stress regulation and doing it before anything else. Doing it, prioritizing it before anything else, before scrolling on your phone, before answering emails. Bit controversial before you feed your kids, so that might mean that you have to get up a little early. I'm still discussing with Alto, my cat, if I can do my stress regulation tools before feeding her. Still duking it out. But really picking one thing that's 5, 10 minutes that's going to regulate your stress over everything else, prioritizing it before anything else, and do it for a month. And I guarantee that after a month, you are going to notice a difference. And it's going to build that positive momentum to want to keep adding things or maybe exploring different tools or asking different questions. But it truly is one thing for yourself for this everyday first thing. And it's not just going to help you. It's not just going to help you. It's going to help the world around you. And it's going to make your life easier. It really is. And it's going to make being able to grow and expand easier. You'll have more energy, more resources. And so, with that, this is the conclusion of the Inside Out Brain. There will be a Pick My Brain webinar on this topic. And so, I really invite you to join if you want to dive deeper into this topic, if you have more scientific questions, but this is really about application. How do I take this and apply it to my everyday life? Because that's kind of the hardest part when we're looking and consuming information is figuring out, okay, well, is this information actually useful in my everyday life? And if so, how do I start integrating it? And so this would be a great webinar for you to attend if you're really struggling with what that one thing should be. And so to do that, I have the link below on how to sign up for the email list. The email list will include the Zoom link. And if you can't attend the time of the Pick My Brain webinar, you are more than welcome to email a question and get access to the replay. This is really a special time, this webinar, because it really is all about you and getting you what you need to bring yourself to that next level, to feel more resourced, to feel more energized, and to be able to show up how you want to show up, right? And that's where stress regulation is really important and why I'm really happy that we ended the Inside Out Brain series on this topic, because that is something that we often miss, right? We do everything else to make sure we have the life that we want, right? We make the money, we have the timeline, we we read the books, we listen to the podcasts, we do all the things. But bringing it back to yourself and your stress regulation is honestly one of the most important aspects of this. That's going to make every one of those things that you're already doing easier and better. So thank you so much for listening. I can't wait to hear your questions. Again, you can sign up for the email list to get those webinars. You can also leave me a question in the comments and stay tuned for the next episode on building your best brain. Take care. Bye.